Okay, back to where we started. Welcome. Thank you so much for coming. We're going to take a deep dive into the biblical understanding of the soul as interpreted by Ethan Shav, one of my favorite biblical scholars. And I want to thank my wife, Debbie, for introducing me to him way back when, many years ago. As you can see from our agenda, we're going to continue our study of the Jewish idea of enlightenment with a focus on the soul. The reason why we're ending up with Ethan Shav is because we've been studying about Jewish meditation per the teachings of Rabbi Aryeh Kaplan. And he's really broadened our horizons as to what meditation is all about. Different forms of meditation have different goals. One form of meditation has a goal of enlightenment. And Rabbi Kaplan has a bird's eye view of a very sophisticated process that people go to get enlightened. And I know that enlightenment is a common idea among spiritual seekers. It has been for 40 or 50 years, whenever, I guess, Eastern philosophy became kind of mainstream. And we have quite a sophisticated definition of it. When Rabbi Kaplan introduced it to us, he started talking about the soul, because enlightenment to him involves progressing through the soul, you might say. And because he takes a very bird's eye view of things, a lot of his ideas are in summary form, and he leaves it up to us to kind of break it down and go to the details. So sometimes I'm going to use details that he provides, and other times I'm going to use details that other scholars provide. In this case, we're going to start looking at what Ethan Shav says. We'll spend a few weeks on this. In addition, we're going to, as we always do, talk about best practices when it comes to our personal meditation. Today, we'll talk about gauging time as a technique for dealing with distractions. Okay, so just a short review with Rabbi Kaplan. He mentions the following. He says that our idea of enlightenment is Ruach HaKodesh. That's when we say somebody has Ruach HaKodesh, that's what other people would say is, oh, he's enlightened. And he says, in order to understand, he says Ruach HaKodesh involves a clarity of understanding, an enhancement of perception, an awareness of the spiritual, and often a complete change of personality. It consists of general enlightenment and perception in its higher true states. Ruach HaKodesh provides the individual with clear, unequivocal perception where he can actually receive information that is not otherwise available. So what he says is that when we become enlightened, it's like we have an antenna up and we're able to perceive external stimuli that aren't generated from our own internal perception. We really have a very high level of frequency, like it's an antenna. And that's a high level. So he's implying that there are levels to this. Okay, what are the levels? He says, in order to understand the concept of Ruach HaKodesh more clearly, one must understand the precise meaning of the word Ruach, which is usually translated as spirit. The meaning of this word becomes evident when we understand the Kabbalistic concept of the soul. Okay, so that's why he's diving into a process of going through the soul, so to speak. It's because Ruach refers to part of the soul. So what he's saying is that when you attain Ruach HaKodesh, when you become enlightened, you have advanced into the soul. And again, because he's talking in summary fashion, he says basically there's three parts of the soul: ruach, and nefesh, ruach, and neshama, and by perfecting yourself, you advance through these levels, through nefesh into ruach, and then beyond. Okay, but our problem was that since he is talking in from his bird's eye view and in summary form, he kind of leaves us hanging as to what exactly these terms mean, nefesh, ruach, and neshama. So fortunately, we have Ethan Shav to kind of help us fill in the blanks. Who is Ethan Shav? The essay that we're going to be looking at is called Soul on Fire, A Theory of Biblical Man. And you can look him up. Associate Fellow, this is about a 15-year-old essay, by the way. The Shalem Center, he has a dynamite study of Kohelet, the book of Ecclesiastes, and Eov, the book of Job. It is remarkable what his insights are. And the reason, and he studied philosophy of science at Tel Aviv University, on and on and on. He's a biblical philosopher. And the reason why he has such credibility in my eyes is because of his method. His method is to take a look at Tanakh and take a look at a word. And, you know, in Hebrew, it's a root-based language. So there's 2 or 3 letters that form the root, and he takes a look and says, how is that word, how is that shurish, that root, used throughout Tanakh? What is the context in which that word is used? And by looking at that method, he's able to gain insights because he also knows the background of Tanakh. He knows history, he knows philosophy, he knows sociology, he knows culture. The Tanakh is giving us information about these disciplines when we learn it, and when you look at how a word is used, you incorporate all these different disciplines and say, oh, this is what this word means. And I think that's a real credible way of learning Tanakh and understanding what the Bible is teaching us. And as an aside, one of the most outstanding biblical teachers today, Menachem Leibtag, he is known for that method. And if you read the commentary, the biblical commentary by Menachem Leibtag, you'll see that's exactly what he does. And he's been doing it for decades. In addition, one of the most prominent scholars today, and who's showing new insights every day, David Foreman, does the exact same thing. Okay, so Ethan Shav is in good company in terms of teaching about what is the Bible teaching us because of this method. Okay, now we have going for us a copy of his essay. And as an aside, as you know, in relating the teachings of Aryeh Kaplan, I've had to read from the books. If anybody comes across the essays written by Aryeh Kaplan in PDF form, please let me know, because I would much rather show a PDF of what these teachings are than just give a summary outline and read from the book. I just haven't found any. But we got Ethan Shav, so that's going to help us tonight. So let's go to him. Okay. Somebody give me a thumbs up to say you can see this essay, Soul of Fire. All right, I see a thumb. Very good. Okay. We're going to go through this. This is what he says. Though it is acknowledged as a primary source of Western ideas on social morals and monotheism, talking about the Bible, when it comes to the afterlife, the Hebrew Bible is deemed mute. This dismissal stems from a striking fact. Nowhere in the Bible are souls witnessed in any post-life habitat. And you can use your own knowledge of Tanakh to back this up. As far as I've never come across one. meaning, what's the afterlife like? Who knows? At least we're not told specifically. Like many ancient mythologies, the New Testament takes us frequently into a soul world in the footsteps of Jesus, and the Quran, too, peeks into the garden of eternal reward. Biblical figures, however, are never seen in the world of the dead. We never view their souls in heaven or in hell. And just as an aside, you can see as footnotes, he's annotated all his sources, and this PDF is going to appear on the website for this class as of midday tomorrow, and you could read this yourself. We never view their souls in heaven or hell, even when a heavenly assembly is portrayed, as in the opening of Job or in the visions of Ezekiel and Isaiah. Human souls are invariably absent. Likewise, when people die, the narrative does not follow them into the beyond. Just think of Elijah ascending from this earthly existence, leaving the reader at the threshold of heaven and quoting, "And he saw him no more." From the fact that we do not see souls in the Hebrew Bible, many have deduced that it fails to articulate a soul afterlife at all, meaning people falling into the lapsing into the idea of, well, if it's not put out in front of my face, then there's nothing else. But as we've seen, even just in the brief study of R.E.A. Kaplan and what he said about Tanakh and Judaism in general, you got to dive deeper. You can't just take what's given in front of your face. You've got to look behind it. The text, however, does not lend itself to an interpretation that fully negates an afterlife either. While souls are not seen there, references are made to its existence. In particular, another world called Sheol is mentioned repeatedly. We know of its dwellers, Rephaim, and biblical figures convey a fear of going there. Okay, we've seen Sheol before. The Bible also upholds the idea of post-mortem judgment, suggesting the possibility of further reward. Additional hints include Samuel speaking to Saul from the grave, Elijah and Hannah being taken to God, and a letter arriving from Elijah after his demise. Most famously, Daniel tells of the virtuous rising to their destiny in the end of days. So what's happening here is that he's saying, we're not being given explicit descriptions of the afterlife, but it's alluded to in many places. Okay. Again, reinforcing the point, even though it's not specifically formally mentioned, it doesn't mean it doesn't exist. Sometimes you got to go in through the back door. Due to its importance, we would expect that if in fact the Bible intended to advance the doctrine of an afterlife, the least it could do is picture the glory of life eternal. But this is not the case. While the Epic of Gilgamesh, the Egyptian Book of the Dead, Canaanite lore, and Greek mythology all include stories of people visiting the world of the dead and returning to report of souls they have seen, the Hebrew canon has none. Okay, so what I also like about what Ethan Dor Shav does is he does some kind of like cross-comparative, cross-cultural analysis. He mentions what other cultures say about the afterlife to kind of compare and contrast what we say. And just because we don't do what they do doesn't mean our method is lacking at all. On the basis of these considerations, scholars concluded that the Hebrew Bible maintained a primitive or immature idea of the soul, which in turn prevented the text's development of a clear notion of an afterlife. And by the way, as we'll see, these scholars are not all Jewish. They assume that the Hebrew Bible must have conceived of man as a being that is cohesive only in connection to the physical body. Something of man may continue to exist after death, but without its body, it loses its meaning. In this view, the treatments of the soul in Greek philosophy and the New Testament are dramatically progressive improvements on the Hebrew Bible, which they say, which it is said cobbled together primitive and soul concepts familiar from Vedic India to pagan Rome. All right, so they're basically, he's taken the point of view of typically non-Jewish commentators who said If it's not explicit in the Bible, it doesn't exist. We know different. This view has become academic commonplace, as the scholar H.W. Robertson writes. In the Old Testament, there is no contrast between the body and the soul, such as the terms instinctively suggest to us. The shades of the dead and Sheol are not called souls, nor does the Old Testament contain any distinct word for body, maybe, maybe not, as it surely would have done, had this idea been sharply differentiated from that of soul. Man's nature, and by the way, just as an aside, since we'll go there, we know the idea of goof, that is commonly translated as body, but that's not body in the same sense as we're talking about here in terms of physical and metaphysical structure. Okay. Man's nature is a product of the two factors, the breath soul, nephesh, that's what this guy is saying, which is his principle of life, and a complex of physical organs which this animates. Separate them and man ceases to be in any real sense of personality. So here we have what Ethan Shav is identifying as a prominent biblical scholar, not Jewish, I'm quite sure, who's basically saying if it's not literally spelled out, it doesn't exist. And basically the biblical idea of man, of people, of humans, is physical only. Okay. Another scholar, Linda Silva, puts it this way: the notion of the soul as an immortal entity which enters the body at birth and leaves it at death is quite foreign to the biblical view of man. This approach pervades, this is Ethan talking, this approach pervades theological discourse as well. Here, for instance, is the official position of the Evangelical Lutheran Church. Quoting, in the Old Testament, soul is essentially the life principle. It always appears in some form or manifestation without which it cannot exist. Hebrews cannot conceive of a disembodied soul. Huh. And then he goes to Ethan goes to the Encyclopedia Britannica. And he says, the Encyclopedia Britannica follows suit, including the Bible, under the following pejorative rubric. The more primitive of these interpretations of the soul has been based on an integralistic evaluation of the human nature. Thus, the individual person has been conceived as a psychophysical organism of which both the material and the non-material constituents are essential in order to maintain a properly integrated personal existence. From such an evaluation, it has followed that death is the fatal shattering of personal existence. Although some constituent elements of the living person has been deemed to survive the disintegration, it has not been regarded as conserving the essential self of personality. So the Encyclopedia Britannica is portraying what you might think is the secular idea of being, which is don't have to worry about what happens when you're dead, because nothing happens when you're dead. Therefore, justifying do whatever the heck you want, because it doesn't matter when you die. So I think the Encyclopedia Britannica accounts for the worldview of a lot of people who have not just abandoned religion, but devalue it and said, you know what, doesn't matter. And as Ethan says, such a primitive idea of man can hardly serve as an inspiration. That's why these people are so miserable and unhappy and setting fire to police stations. Aside from the issue of the afterlife, there is a strong linguistic component in the way many scholars dismiss the Hebrew Bible's idea of man. As a general rule, they were completely baffled by the Bible's terminology regarding the essence of man and the human metaphysical makeup. They despaired of finding a consistent use of the Bible's terminology. This linguistic despair is connected to a general prejudice against the Hebrew Bible's philosophical rigor, but also stands on its own as one of the main reasons for misunderstanding the Bible's metaphysical teachings and for dismissing it so summarily. So he's also pointing out that we have a very complex idea of what the soul is, And the fact that we might have several terms to describe the soul, different dimensions of the soul, or different aspects of the soul, throws people off. So-called scholars are saying, well, I want my life easy. Give me the term you guys use. And if it's not like a simple word, then they're like, it doesn't exist. Okay. What is the semantic issue at hand, asks Ethan. Contrary to the Christological tradition, dominating biblical lexicography through the 19th century and beyond, the Hebrew canon does not uphold the dualistic body-soul doctrine, submitting instead three soul terms: nefesh, ruach, and neshama, the same terms that Rabbi Kaplan brought up. In general, Western thinkers struggle to fit the three Hebrew souls into the later single soul dogma. In the Gospels, the human core is called psyche, while meaning soul, and pneuma, spirit, is primarily reserved for God's emanation, as in the Holy Spirit. The Greek translation and their English offshoots attempt to equate nefesh with soul. Okay. So the Greeks and Christians had a tough time with our three-dimensional idea of the soul, and they couldn't fit a round peg into a square hole. And you can see that this whole dualistic stuff, body, soul, that's not a Jewish idea. But even a superficial reading of the Bible inevitably reveals that these easy correlations falter, and the inevitable result was a diffusion of the Hebrew terms. So they said, they basically decided to say, we don't understand the Bible, so this is what we're going to say the Bible means. And the King James Version, for example, ruach is variously translated as wind, spirit, and breath, but also occasionally as mind, anger, courage. Nefesh, though predominantly rendered as soul, is also translated as breath, self, mind, heart, will, desire, and appetite. Even the infrequent neshama is variously rendered as breath, spirit, and soul. From the opposite perspective, when encountering the word soul in the King James Version, the reader has no way of knowing if it refers to nefesh, neshama, or nidvati, spirit. Spirit can be translation of ruach, neshama, or ov, and okay. So he's basically telling us that people just don't get it. They haven't used, and why don't they get it? They haven't used a systematized method of understanding the Bible. But fortunately, Ethan has one. In what follows, I intend to show that the original Hebrew terminology was both distinct and consistent, and that the very absence of visible souls in the Hebrew Bible points to a more commanding alternative conception of man's inner being. I also intend to show that while the Bible does not uphold the soul-body dichotomy, which most critics have considered prerequisite to a belief in the persistence of the soul after death, it does demonstrate the presence of a four-element structure of both matter and spirit that supports a belief in the life eternal. This is where I think he's hit a home run, because he's connecting the physical to the metaphysical. He already has these three dimensions of the soul, nefesh, ruach, and neshama, and in some way he's going to incorporate what we refer to as body into this four dimensions as a continuum. This is why I think it's mind-blowing. This structure has been either overlooked or confused with Aristotle's schema to the point that the spiritual implications of the biblical usage have gone undiscovered. And isn't it so interesting? Isn't it so interesting how Ethan is saying here, we've had this sophisticated understanding of being, and we lost a system and a method for understanding it. And that's exactly what Rabbi Kaplan was saying about meditation. Rabbi Kaplan's whole point in his his promotion and advocacy of meditation was that, hey, for years, this was part of mainstream Judaism. And for all kinds of reasons, due to history and politics and everything else, it got sidelined and then dropped. But we had it. And the same problem arose with what Ethan calls this like metaphysical philosophy. We had this. And the Bible is full of stories of it. But somewhere along the line, it got sidelined and then dropped and replaced by this Greek stuff and this Christian stuff and this other stuff. And you could see even today, if you went to 100 Jews and said, you know, what is your idea of the soul? Either they will, 99 would say, either I don't know, or they'd say, oh, you know, body, soul, the soul goes into the body. They'd give you some Greek idea. So I think Ethan picked up on the same problem as Rabbi Kaplan and is also attempting to fix it. In the same way, by bringing forth the teaching, the biblical teachings, to help us understand this sophisticated metaphysical and highly spiritual perspective we have on life. Thus, scholars searching the Hebrew Bible for signs of an interest in the afterlife have been looking through the wrong intellectual lenses and have therefore missed the Hebrew Bible's profound teaching concerning man's constitution and destiny. To gain access to this metaphysical worldview of the ancient Israelite sages, we must stop looking for a landscape of heaven under the light of our preconceived expectations. In ancient Israelite philosophy, the netherworld is to be understood, not imagined. The divine soul is to be realized, not seen. For us, it's experiential. And this is where we're going to stop on this segment for this week. So hope everybody's saying, oh, no, that means you're going to come back next week. And now we're going to go to learning about best practices of meditation. Okay. So I know we have some newbies here. This is a class to introduce you to meditation, get a taste of it, and develop a basic skill. I'm not a meditation instructor. This is not a class in mysticism. It's not a class in Kabbalah. But at the same time, it makes no sense to have a class about meditation unless you know what meditation is. The meditation we do is fundamental meditation that Rabbi Kaplan says is fundamental. It's to distance yourself from your thoughts. It's to be able to control the contents of your mind. Rabbi Kaplan's basic definition is meditation is the practice of controlling the contents of your mind. That is what you find Taoists saying. That's what you find Buddhists saying. That's meditation is meditation. And Rabbi Kaplan makes that point. What the meditation we do, the Buddhists are doing, and the Sufis are doing, it's meditation. Okay. And the essential skill is to be able to not get carried away by the contents of your mind, be able to take a step away from that and just let it ride and remain centered from it. So unfortunately, like is often the case, Rabbi Kaplan keeps talking about it, but he has not, to my understanding, produced a how-to manual on how to do it. But fortunately, we got a good one. Bhante is a world-renowned meditator, and he uses this form of meditation called Vipassana meditation, which is Buddhist. Is exactly what Rabbi Kaplan's talking about. And since Bhante, he really dives in to give tips on how to meditate, we're using him as our resource. So we've been talking about best practices, and today we're going to start a chapter on dealing with distractions. And this is what he says. At some time, every meditator encounters distractions during practice, and methods are needed to deal with them. Many useful strategies have been devised to get you back on track more quickly than that of trying to push your way through by sheer force of will. Very important point. He keeps telling us it's not a question of gutting through. You got to finesse your way through. You've got to use a method. Concentration and mindfulness go hand in hand. Each one complements the other. If either one is weak, the other will eventually be affected. Bad days are usually characterized by poor concentration. Your mind just keeps floating around. You need a method of reestablishing your concentration, even in the face of mental adversity. Luckily, you have it. In fact, you can choose from an array of traditional practical maneuvers, which I find interesting because he's basically saying the tips he's providing are not just restricted to Buddhists. I mean, you can bet that when the philosophers and the prophets of old, even in biblical times, when they were doing advanced meditation in order to be able to get prophecy, they were doing the same things to solve their problems. So the first problem in dealing with distractions we're going to talk about is time gauging. Let's suppose a distraction has pulled you away from the breath, meaning that when you're meditating, you're trying to focus on your breath. And you suddenly realize that you've been daydreaming. The trick is to pull all the way out of whatever has captured you, to break its hold on you completely, so you can go back to the breath with full attention. You do this by gauging the length of time you were distracted. This is not a precise calculation. You don't need a precise figure, just a rough estimate. You can measure it in minutes or by significant thoughts. Just say to yourself, okay, I've been distracted for about 2 minutes, or since the dog started barking, or since I started thinking about money. When you first start practicing this technique, you will do it by talking to yourself. Once the habit is well established, you can drop that, and the action becomes wordless and very quick. The whole idea, remember, is to pull out of the distraction and get back to the breath. You pull out of the thought by making it the object of inspection just long enough to glean from it a rough approximation of its duration. The interval itself is not important. Once you are free of the distraction, drop the whole thing and go back to the breath. Do not get hung up on the estimate. All right, I've done this a lot of times. What he's saying is, you're sitting there and you're trying to focus on your breath, and then you start thinking about, I've got to get some pizza. And then you realize you are thinking about eating pizza. And you realize, I'm supposed to be meditating and focusing on my breath. So you say to yourself, how long have I been thinking about pizza? Probably 5 minutes. Or you could flag it to a particular thing. Oh, I started thinking about pizza when I heard the bell rang upstairs, because that was probably somebody ordering pizza. All right, so that's when I started. Whatever the technique is, it makes you mindful that you were distracted. And becoming mindful that you were distracted helps you get back to being, to meditating, to focusing on the breath. So whether you're marking it in terms of a time approximation or by an event or something else, this time gauging or the duration gauging helps you become mindful and remember that you were distracted, and it makes it much easier to slide back into meditating. So that is a good technique. And as he said, when you first start out, you have to develop the habit, the tactic of actually saying, yeah, I was thinking about pizza for 5 minutes. You say this, lowly, but you say it, and then eventually it becomes intuitive. You snap up. You say, oh, you think to yourself, you're thinking about pizza, but you don't even have to say the words. You just recognize intuitively, there I was daydreaming again. Now I can realize now I'm mindful. I can go back to focusing on the breath. But you have to develop the habit of saying it verbally, actively, and then it becomes second nature. All right, so that's one tactic used to deal with distractions, and we will continue talking about more because he's got a bunch. Okay. So now we're going to meditate. So we're going to stop the recording.